Late one night in October 2001, a Fort Worth man named Gregory Biggs was walking down the freeway when he is suddenly struck by a passing car. His body goes through the windshield and he becomes stuck half in and half out of the car, still alive, with his torso angled down into the front passenger seat. But the driver, who is a nurse named Shantae Mallard, does not stop and does not call 911, doesn't assist in any way, despite the fact that she had medical training. And what she does do next is very shocking and makes you think, is this just an accident or is it murder?
Fort Worth 911, how can I help you?
Hi, I'm Todd Breedlove, off-duty fireman, and at 2800 Cobb Park Drive in the park, we have a body here. White male, he is cold, got rigor, his body's contorted, he is gone.
I was in the office. I was working that weekend, and I received a deceased body found in Cobb Park on the east side of Fort Worth. A lot of older African Americans kind of hang around that area. They'll cook, they'll play games, but also a lot of people drive through Cobb Park and they use drugs there.
I'd spend hours in Cobb Park. It had a really bad reputation at that time. We got calls to Cobb Park daily. I would say at least once every shift.
So when I drive through the park, I can clearly see a body of a white male. When I examined the body, I was looking for any type of damage, like was he shot, was he stabbed, was he struck by an instrument? And you didn't see those type of injuries on his body, not to his chest, his face, you didn't see that. What you saw was the leg was very badly contorted. His left foot was laying across his stomach. It was broken so badly. The way rigor mortis was set in, his arm, his hand was twisted in an odd position. So he'd been dead for a few hours. I also noticed that it was covered in shards of glass. Next to his body, I could see some very entrenched tire marks. It looks like he may have been hit or struck by a vehicle. So he's been in the park. I'm assuming he was there at night. Someone ran him over and just left him there. It's very possible he could have been a homeless person in the park sleeping when he was struck by a car. It looks like an accident or something that our traffic investigation unit work. Not us, not homicide.
Under Texas law, the typical charge for a hit and run is FSRA, which is failure to stop and render aid. In 2001, FSRA was punishable as a second-degree felony with anything from 2 years probation to 10 years in prison when a death was involved.
So at that point, I called traffic investigation and said, hey, I've got an incident here that looks like it's probably going to be a hit and run or failure to stop and render aid. So our traffic investigation unit made the scene. Anytime you have a death, the first thing you have to do is figure out who your victim is. He did have ID. The victim was Gregory Biggs.
They learned that he grew up in Duncanville, which is a small town east of Fort Worth, and married his high school sweetheart. At the time of Greg's death, he was divorced, which under Texas law makes his 17-year-old son, Brandon Biggs, his next of kin. The police also learned that Gregory, who suffers from some mental health issues, had been living at a homeless shelter at the time of his death.
My sister called. She goes, hey, he was real good friends with Greg Biggs. And I was like, yeah. She goes, well, on the news tonight, they're storing, I think he's dead. And I'm like, what? And I watched the news. Yeah, and it was him. There was following news reports, I guess I remember seeing, that he had mental issues and was homeless. I didn't see any of that in high school. But I guess from what I understand, bipolar and stuff comes can come in later in life. And, other than just the shock at the moment, I start, questioning myself. How did I lose touch with him? How did I not work harder to find him? Met Greg Biggs back in 1979, back in high school, and we hit it right off. It was just one of those things, we'd known each other all our lives. He would make friends with everybody and anybody, anywhere, anytime. I mean, it may sound cliche or cheesy, but he would give you the shirt off his back.
When you have a case like this, the autopsy is extremely crucial in terms of looking for evidence. The medical examiner can tell by the autopsy the way the body was damaged. Gregory Biggs had broken legs, broken ankle. He has a real major laceration across his lower abdomen, and there's scratches on the body. And extremely important is that you see lividity on the shoulders and the front part of his body.
Lividity is a post-mortem phenomenon that occurs in the body when the blood pulls after the heart stops pumping.
And so, because of the lividity, we know that he was laying in a different position when he died, and he had to have been moved from that location to another position at the park.
With evidence of Greg's body being moved, this is no longer a traffic accident. This has become a murder investigation.
In Dallas today, family members gathered to remember 37-year-old Gregory Biggs.
Within a few days after Gregory Biggs is found dead in the park, his son has the very, very sad task of arranging for his father's funeral, and it was just attended by his son and a few others.
I think it's good, really, to make my dad known more as not just a homeless man, because he wasn't always that way.
Greg was a solid, loyal friend. Sweet and simple. Nothing complicated. You knew where you stood with him.
So we pretty much know what we're looking for based on the injuries to the victim. There's going to be significant damage to the vehicle. So now you're looking at who fixes cars, anyone who's towed a vehicle, anyone that's seen a vehicle that has damage. So we put that out to the media, offer a reward. But 3 or 4 months into the investigation, we were just stuck with no suspects and we had no real direction. And then we received a tip.
Tarrant County Sheriff's Department, may I help you?
Not that long ago, there was an article on the paper about a man with a head down in Kyle Park. There was a hit and run. And my best friend's homegirl is the one that did it.
What was unique about the case when we got it is that typically we get a case and the police have finished their investigation and they just give us a final product. We got involved on the ground floor on this one, so we were actively involved in the initial investigation. I can't think of another case that I've ever dealt with that has had this level of just absurdity. This woman who called into the police, she'd been at a party and heard this woman she identified as Shantae Mallard tell the story about being at the club months earlier. She was drinking some at the bar. She had half of an ecstasy pill. And when she drove home, she hit some white guy with her car.
And then she drove her car with him still on the car. And she drove her car home and parked it in the garage. And the man was dying, but he was still alive.
It sounded crazy. We were getting information that 4 months later, the car could still be in Shantae Mallard's garage. Technically, if you receive information like what we received in the 911 call, you could issue an arrest warrant for Shantae Mallard. But Richard is a prosecutor's prosecutor and incredibly thorough. And so we decide, let's write a search warrant. Let's see, is this car in fact still there?
police department goes to Shantae Mallard's house with a search warrant. And there they get way more than they bargained for.
She said, I didn't mean to hit him. I was shocked.
Blood is still in the visor. Hair is still in the headliner of the car. She, in essence, hid him from anyone else who could render medical attention.
What did you see?
The backside of a body lodged out of the window.
It was the darkest night of Greg Bick's life.
The dispatchers put out a request for assistance for the detectives to run a search warrant on a female, Shantae Mallard. And Shantae answered the door. Normally, when somebody shows up at your house with a search warrant, they want to know why you're searching, why you're there. She obviously knew it was coming because she didn't say anything. We directed her to the living room, and then they began their search. Immediately, I saw the vehicle in the garage. What was left of it. Huge hole in the windshield and what looked like dried blood where his body had hit the windshield.
Here we are 4 months later, and the car's still there, and hair and blood is still in the headliner. There were still ties to the crime in her possession.
Shantae had her head down and out of nowhere said, I didn't mean to hit him. I was shocked.
So on her own, not in response to any police officer questioning, Shantae Mallard comes out with this admission that she is the person who hit Greg Biggs.
I wasn't expecting that. We handcuffed her and we took her to the station.
Once Shantae Mallard starts being interviewed down at the station, she comes out with this version of what happened that night, and it is a story unlike anything I've ever heard before.
Shantae Mallard tells them that she had gone to a club that night.
She says that she'd only had 2 drinks and no drugs.
She also tells police she believes that someone slipped something into her drink.
Because when the club closed that night, she was feeling really loose and a little wobbly.
And that on the way home, on the freeway, she had struck a man.
Shantae described it, he was in my car and just stuck in the right passenger windshield.
She panicked and she did not know what to do, and that she drove home with him still impaled into the windshield. And she pulls into the garage and puts the door down. She tells police that she was apologizing to him profusely in the garage, and at one point he responded, like groaned or something in some way. So her statement indicates that he was alive at the time.
Shantae told the police that after all that, she went into her house and just sat on the kitchen floor and cried, claimed that she did not know how long the man lived for.
And then Shantae tells police that she called an on-again, off-again love interest named Vaughn, and that he got rid of the body. She said that he took care of it.
She really deflects all blame on this unknown person named Vaughn that takes care of the body, and she has no idea what happens to the body.
I think we expected that this is going to be someone who was intoxicated, hit somebody on a freeway, and just failed to stop. But it evolved in such a way that it was unthinkable and unspeakable.
Police draft an arrest warrant, and she's arrested. The next morning, Richard and I went to look at the vehicle in the Fort Worth Police Pound, and inside of the door well, there is a fingerprint in blood, and when we test that blood, it comes back to be Greg Biggs, which shows he was alive and able to exert enough force or enough pressure to make a fingerprint. Our theory was he was pulling himself out of the windshield. He's struggling to live, and every breath he took had to be so painful.
We took the time to travel that road that she traveled down. We literally counted all the places that could provide emergency care, all the phone booths that were there.
Also, we came to find out that Shantae worked in a number of different medical facilities as a certified nurse's assistant.
Shantae Mallard knows how to take steps to get him help, and they chose not to do so.
When she drove him home into her garage and closed the door, she in essence hid him from anyone else who could render medical attention, who could save his life.
If she had hit him and then immediately stopped and tried to help him, she probably would have been looking at a charge of intoxication manslaughter. And because she was a first offender, she probably would have seriously been looking at probation.
She's originally arrested for failing to stop and render aid, and we knew that at a minimum she had done that. But in Texas, we have what's called felony murder. And that is if you commit one felony and you just simply do another act that results in someone's death, that is also murder here in Texas.
The risk of raising the charge to felony murder on this case is we go all in on the higher charge, and by seeking more than we had to begin with, we might end up with nothing. So Shantae, in her statement she gave to the police, is mentioning somebody named Vaughn, someone who was actually involved in the crime of disposing of the body. But we could not find a Vaughn, or could not find anyone that even knew a Vaughn. Even people that purport to be her friends don't have any idea who this person is.
The fact that they can't find any more information about him, it's suspicious. I mean, is Vaughn even a real person?
In Texas, all felonies, as a general rule, are presented to a grand jury. And so I used the grand jury as an investigative body. We brought in multiple possible witnesses.
One of those people was her best friend, Talisi Fry.
We bring her friend T in front of the grand jury in the hopes of finding out what happened in the missing hours between Shantae hitting Greg Biggs and Greg Biggs' body being found in Cobb Park. So T testifies in front of the grand jury that Shantae shows up at her house the next morning after hitting Greg Biggs. And there's no description of seeing Shantae the night before. We believe she knows more than what she's saying. And we subpoena her cell phone records. And we find all these different phone calls that tell a very different story. We know she was talking to Shantae Mallard that night. And it's just a matter of finding where she's vulnerable, what will finally make her tell us the truth. We bring T in front of the grand jury in the hopes of finding out what happened in the missing hours before Greg Biggs' body being found in Cobb Park.
I told T, if you don't tell me the truth, you could be subject to being charged with perjury, and that's a felony in the state of Texas. And I think at a certain point, T realizes that if I continue down this road, all I'm going to get out of it is an indictment. Or I can turn around and cooperate, and the DA's office has told me they'll give me immunity. And at the end of the day, T gave us the real story of what happened.
T describes how Shantae gets off of work and she comes over to T's apartment, and then they get dressed and they go to Joe's Big Bamboo. T said they had 2 or 3 drinks and they closed the bar down. Shantae decides she's fine to drive and she goes home. And after Shantae is back at home around 3 a.m. in the morning, and Shantae calls her, she whispers, "Come pick me up." T comes over to Shantae's house, and our best estimate is that it's around 3:30 a.m. in the morning. And so still pretty shortly after hitting Greg Biggs. I mean, for all we know, Greg Biggs could still have been alive in the garage.
And when T came to pick up Shantae ran outside, didn't let her in the house. He just got in the car and said, "Drive." And so they went off and drove, and she was talking to her about what had happened. And it wasn't 2 hours later that she brought her back to the house. And by the time T is back at the house, Gregory Biggs had died. I fully believe that Shantae made a very concerted effort to not give T an opportunity to know exactly what had happened. She did not want to give her a chance to see that Gregory Biggs could still be alive.
And T says, I tell Shantae, call 911. And Shantae refuses to do that.
At the time of the indictment, what we lacked was the complete story about disposing of the body. We still had to nail down the individuals that helped Shantae. So Shantae, in her statement she gave to the police, is mentioning somebody named Vaughn, but we could not find a Vaughn or could not find anyone that even knew a Vaughn.
We eventually find Vaughn when a woman contacts the police department and gives them an anonymous tip. Vaughn is a person named Clee Jackson. The DA investigators go and interview Clee Jackson. He tells investigators that he helped Shantae with moving Greg Biggs' body, and he says he got help from his cousin, Herbert Tyrone Cleveland.
Both these people have criminal histories, and that gives us leverage because they're both facing not just a little bit of time, but a lot of time. They came in with attorneys. We laid out, you can tell us the truth, testify in our trial, and you will get a lower range of punishment.
They struck deals with prosecution. They were charged with tampering with physical evidence. They'd received 9 and 10 years in prison in exchange for their testimony.
Unlike T, Clee Jackson and Tyrone Cleveland actually helped dispose of Greg Biggs' body. And if the prosecutors are seen as letting them off too easy, this can weaken their case against Shantae Mallard in the eyes of the jury.
We knew the reputation of Shantae Mallard's attorneys. That was going to be the first card that was going to be played, is these people got a sweet deal to make up lies about our client. It was important to us, the jury, look at the deal and say, 10 years in prison does not seem like a sweet deal.
I remember when all of this started. Richard and Christy Jack, they were the stars of the Tarrant County DA's office, so we all knew each other. And then this crazy case happened with this crazy scenario. Publicity got bigger and bigger, and probably was Christy and Richard's once-in-a-lifetime case. And we all know that that's the kind of case that can make your career or break your career. As the trial approaches, the media attention got bigger and bigger, and at some point the judge decided to allow cameras in the courtroom. So the pressure that also brought on all the lawyers involved had to have been huge.
It wasn't a local story. It wasn't a regional story. It wasn't a state story. It was a national and international story. It exploded because it was such a crazy story.
The courtroom was packed. I remembered almost tripping over one of the news truck's cords as I was walking in that morning.
On day one of the trial, when Shantae Mallard pled not guilty to felony murder, but guilty to FSRA, which is failure to stop and render aid. It would seem like to a jury, she's taking full responsibility for the one crime, FSRA, while maintaining her innocence to guilt, and I thought that was a pretty good strategic decision on the part of her lawyers.
I want to tell you about a set of facts, about a crime, almost the perfect crime. I truly believe that juries form opinions at the very beginning of trials. And I want the jury to understand all of the decisions that she made before she ever got home, all the places that she passes, all the places where she could stop and she doesn't, and she goes home. And when she gets home, she does call for help, but the help isn't for Greg Biggs. The help is for her. And T says, when Shantae calls her, she whispers, "Come pick me up." She whispered because she didn't want Greg Biggs to hear her. That just tells me. Greg Biggs is still very much alive in her garage.
Within an hour and a half to 2 hours of this accident, Gregory Biggs was dead. And the state tells you that that amounts to murder. I'm telling you, that's not murder.
Jeff and Reagan's defense is this is an overreach. This isn't murder. This is only failing to stop and render aid. This is a young lady who simply panicked. She got scared. She was under the influence of something that she'd never taken before in her life. She didn't know what to do.
The main thing we're trying to demonstrate is that the injuries that were sustained were not going to be fatal, that they could have been treated.
He does not have injury patterns that are consistent with instantaneous death. The other injuries will lead to death if not medically attended, but will take time to occur.
He very firmly believed the cause of death was directly related to leaving Gregory Biggs in her garage.
Richard and I, and Miles Brissett, he was the third prosecutor on the case, are very visual when we present cases to the jury. This was incredibly important in this case, and it was Miles's idea to bring the car into the courtroom.
They told me that they had this way they figured out to bring the vehicle into the courtroom. It was brilliant. It was absolutely wonderful. It has to be taken apart to fit into the courtroom. So they have to bring it in and put it together so that we can show the jury that fits with our story.
I'm familiar with bringing physical evidence into the courtroom, and Richard and Christy and I were all taught from the very beginning to try and do whatever you can to make the crime come alive to the jury. So the more you can do that with the actual evidence, the more you can make a jury appreciate what it's like to have been there. That had to be hugely helpful.
I think showing how close the driver's seat was to the passenger seat really brought home in a very palpable way how close she was to this man that she just let die.
So the physical evidence is presented to the jury. It's very compelling. But next up, her friends are going to take the stand.
We know it's a risk to bring her friends to the stand.
We're all wondering, what are they going to say? Is their testimony going to paint her to be a compassionate person? Or they're going to put the nail in the coffin?
What do your friends call you?
T.
On October 25th, 2001, did you have some plans to go out with Shantae?
Yes, I did.
T describes how Shantae gets off of work and she comes over to T's apartment, and it's probably 10:30 by then.
We have a drink.
What else did you do?
We split an X pill.
Talk about ecstasy?
Yes. And we smoked a joint.
And they go to Joe's Big Bamboo.
What kind of place is that?
It's an adult nightclub.
And they close the bar down. Then they leave, and T testifies that Shantae is too intoxicated to drive.
So who drove?
I did.
And what happened when you got to your place?
I offered to follow Shantae home, and she said she didn't need me to.
And then she gives us the phone call after Shantae has hit Greg Biggs, when she gives the words, "Come pick me up."
Like, as if a whisper.
Like she didn't want someone to hear it?
Yes.
When she called T to come to her house that night, Shantae did a good job of keeping T away from the body as long as possible, but she does at some point get a chance to go in the garage and see the body.
I saw the backside of a body lodged out of the window.
And when she's talking about it, to my eyes, it's still visibly affecting her because it's shocking. It's shocking to see a body like that.
And did she call 911?
No.
During the trial, I make a habit of looking at the defendant. I like to see their reaction. I noticed there were less tears when T was testifying and more anger at the times I did glance over there. She was angry. She'd been betrayed. So then T goes home, and Shantae called Cleet to help get rid of the evidence, to transport the body to Cobb Park.
With bloodshot eyes, Shantae Mallard listened to hours of testimony, the last of which came from her former boyfriend.
Cleet was challenging because Cleet did not like me.
You could tell there was a body in the car. Were you upset?
Yeah. I just got out of prison. I just got my life right to be a father to my kids.
She thought she just got you in trouble.
I knew she got me in trouble.
So you have him on the blanket, and what do you do with the blanket?
Tied up.
And then what'd you do?
kind of like apologized, sort of, to him.
Here you have this hardened criminal, and you see the single little tear where he says he apologized to Greg Biggs. Clete Jackson, to me, was a very compelling witness. You knew he didn't want to be there. You knew that what he was saying was the truth and that it pained him. I think Shantae was trying to divest herself of all of the decisions after hitting Greg Biggs. But Shantae was the one that decided they needed to get rid of the body. In fact, there was discussion about burning Greg Biggs' body in the car, and Clete Jackson was the one who had the decency to say no.
We just want to put him somewhere where his family could find him so they can bury him because it was an accident.
Her friends didn't want to be there. They didn't want to testify. They weren't on the prosecutor's side, but they still told the truth. That's just so beautifully credible. It was a great help to the case.
Did you decide to call somebody?
Tyrone, my cousin.
And what happened when you got to the park?
We took him out the car. Tyrone and I.
How'd you get the blanket open?
Cut it off.
And who gave you the knife to cut it off with?
Shantae gave it to Tyrone. He handed it to me.
Clete helped our narrative by just demonstrating that Shantae was actively involved in the disposal of the body.
And this is very harmful to the defense because it establishes one more time how much Shantae was trying to hide what she did in a very cold-blooded manner.
In her first interview with police, Shantae Mallard talks about how other people are responsible for moving Greg Biggs' body. But Clete Jackson then comes in and explains, no, she was right there with us. She was part and parcel dumping the body in Cobb Park.
Shantae talks about driving into her garage and shutting the door. This is way after that. So putting these friends on the stand and dragging out of them that she's still orchestrating this, she's still trying to make sure she doesn't get caught, is a huge part of the case.
Since Clete and I did not get along, I was concerned that Clete was going to say things that I'd never heard before when he's being cross-examined. I was worried he could turn on us at any minute.
When Shantae arrived at Joe's Big Bamboo Club, and when you first saw her there, you immediately noticed that she looked different.
Yes, sir.
And by different, you mean that she looked like she was under the influence of something that you had never seen her be under the influence of. Is that right?
Right.
The defense strategy was to focus on the level of intoxication, and I expected them to do that.
The defense is wanting to play up the fact that Shantae was messed up on alcohol and ecstasy. The risk is that one juror might think she probably wouldn't have acted that way if she wouldn't have been high or drunk or messed up that night. So I'm going to cut her a little slack because of it.
Raise your right hand. You solemnly swear.
After the testimony about what all happened to Greg Biggs is complete, the prosecutors call his son, Brandon Biggs, to the stand to talk about what kind of a man his dad was.
How old are you?
20 years old.
Are you in school?
Yes.
And what kind of degree are you seeking?
Church ministries degree.
What kind of work did your father do?
He was self-employed as a bricklayer.
What kind of person was your father?
I'll say he was very hardworking. Although he didn't have many friends, he was very friendly.
As a prosecutor, I'm not effective very much, but I will never forget listening to Brandon talk about how his father was a very friendly person, but he didn't have very many friends. And it was just so sad, and there were tears in the gallery.
Did your father have any kind of illness?
He was diagnosed with bipolar disorder and mild schizophrenia.
Can you tell me what the circumstances of him losing his home and his vehicle were?
He had found a girlfriend. She had wrecked our car, and he had asked me one day if he should help her. I told him yes, I thought he should. And when he helped her financially, loaning her money, he was unable to make his truck payment. And that's how it was taken from him.
So without his truck, how was he able to continue working in his business?
He was not.
And ultimately, did he lose his home?
He did.
Gregory Biggs is a person that loses their livelihood, their car, their home, because they did an unselfish act. They helped someone. It painted this diametrically opposite picture of Gregory Biggs from Shantae Mallard. It gave us a crucial piece that we needed for argument, which is that here is the way a life is supposed to be lived. If you want to know what a person with character looks like, look at the person that's the subject of this autopsy report. Meeting Brandon, finding out about him and his life, that he had a connection with his father, did something that was absolutely crucial, that without him we wouldn't have had. It humanized him.
I always write notes of what the defense says in their opening statement so that I can turn around and use it in closing argument. Jeff Kearney talks about it being the darkest night of all. How can this be the darkest night for her? She's alive.
It was dark, and his body was racked with pain. Gripping the door pocket, he tried to right himself, and he struggled to find the words.
And when Shantae Mallard closed the garage door, closed the door from the kitchen into the garage, and turned the lights off, it was the darkest night of Greg Biggs' life.
I get the initial accident. You're scared. You're drunk, you're stoned, whatever. I get that. But hours later, when you sober up, or you're coming down or whatever, and you still do nothing, and you are a healthcare professional, you intentionally waited till the person was dead. You murdered them. That's just evil.
There's no question in this case that Shantae's failure to render aid or call for assistance probably caused his death. That's not murder.
Being first chair in my closing argument, my main focus is responding to what Jeff had to say. It's the closing argument, and his focus on the law, his focus on how this doesn't fit. From a legal standpoint, lots of people in the legal field struggle with felony murder. My experience is that lay people do not. There's a dead body. They're dead because of you. That's murder. So the jury comes back in an hour, and I would lie if I said that I wasn't nervous.
State ready?
State ready, Your Honor.
Defense ready?
We're ready, Your Honor.
Bring in the jury. Bring in the jury.
The jury comes back in an hour. I've learned over time, you really can't predict anything from jury deliberations.
We at the jury find the defendant, Shantae Juan Mallard, guilty of the offense of murder as charged in count 1 of the indictment.
Jurors unanimously agreed with the prosecution. Now they must decide what price Shantae Mallard will pay for leaving Gregory Biggs to die in her car windshield.
The range of punishment for what she's convicted of for felony murder is 5 to 99 years or life.
After the defense put on a very impressive array of witnesses from Shantae's world, the defense called Shantae Mallard herself to the stand. Typically in a criminal case, if you're going to put a defendant on the stand, you do it in the guilt phase to try to argue they're not connected to what happened. The defense didn't do that in guilt, and they wanted to put her on the stand in punishment because at that point they needed the jury to see what a great person she is, that she's a first offender, that she's sorry, therefore she would get the lower range of punishment, possibly even probation.
I have ruined my family's life. I have put people through pain. And I am so truly sorry. I am so sorry, Brandon.
She was sympathetic to a point, but the decisions that she made shows that she was only thinking about her own self and how to get out of the situation. It was a selfishness that spanned 4 months. And even then, when she was arrested, lying to the police.
She had taken the ecstasy willingly. No one had slipped anything in her drink. And when she talked about someone taking care of the body, she was actually instrumental in that.
Now the prosecutors had their chance to cross-examine Shantae Mallard.
When you realized you hit somebody, you didn't think, well, I've got to get some help, did you?
I didn't know what to do.
What I'm trying to do is demonstrate this is a person that is selfish. This is a person that lacks a moral compass, that has no excuse for her behavior.
I wasn't capable of making decisions.
You weren't capable of making decisions? You made a decision to get in the car and drive, right?
Yes.
You made a decision to take the ecstasy.
Yes.
You made a decision, the decisions involved in driving that got you to the point where you hit Gregory Biggs.
Yes.
And after hitting him, your ability to decide was gone?
After I was on the ecstasy and I just started making a lot of bad decisions and I was scared. I didn't know what to do.
So it was the ecstasy's fault?
And I mean, it was a master class on cross-examination. There was no place she could turn. We asked the jury to hand down a life sentence, and the jury gave her what amounted to almost a life sentence. She was sentenced to 50 years for murder.
There are no winners in a case like this. Just as we all lost Greg, you all will be losing your daughter.
One of the most impactful things that I saw in this case was when Greg Biggs' son, Brandon, took the stand.
To Shantae, I personally would like to say that I would accept your apology. But in return, I hope that you would accept my forgiveness.
Brandon's forgiveness, Brandon's compassion, Brandon's faith never wavered from the first meeting to the last statement before the jury. Every case you deal with the prosecutor is kind of a barometer to help you measure and how you weigh conduct, because you have a tremendous amount of power. This case stands alone.
Brandon Biggs is the embodiment of forgiveness and compassion. And yet, on the stand, one of the things that he said was, I forgive you, but consequences are still owed. We all make mistakes. But if you make a mistake and you realize you make a mistake, it's not too late to do the right thing.
In 1994, I took on one of the newest, biggest cold cases that I ever handled in my career. And at that time, I was a pretty new chief of one of the district courts in Harris County. The sudden deaths of John and Ruth High happened 6 years earlier in 1987. The Highs were a really nice elderly couple, but there were a lot of dark twists and turns trying to figure out what happened with this case. What the investigators uncovered was a person so twisted and diabolical that he even started to believe his own lies, and that's what made him even harder to catch.
Even if, for instance, there was something that I had done and I confessed to it, y'all dragged right down with me.
He's equal to the core.
It took a cleverly devised phone call ruse to try and get enough evidence on the killer, but would that be enough? I had to go to trial basically relying on the testimony of one pretty unsympathetic witness. How are y'all?
Good, how are you?
Oh my God, so good to see you.
Good to see you too.
It's been too long, you know it?
Too long.
Too much. How are you? How are you? Give me a hug.
All right.
I remember this case because it was one of my first introductions to the best guys at HPD homicide, because it was my first cold case and because the victims were so sweet and innocent. What were the family dynamics back then?
Everything was normal.
Well, I recently graduated college and recently got married. So.
And I was in college at the time.
When it happened.
Mm-hmm.
So talk about that day when you first hear that something horrible's happened.
I was with my dad at one of the facilities we operate, and we were there working together, and my mother called him and said that Nobody's heard from my grandparents.
And he went over there to check on him.
Mm-hmm.
On October 8th, 1987, 5 p.m. in the afternoon, the Houston Police Department receives a phone call from a gentleman named Ken High. He was concerned about his parents. They had not been able to reach him by telephone, and so Ken High had gone around the house, peeking in the windows, and he noticed his mother was laying on the bed, and he was concerned that she may have passed away. And he wanted an officer to come there to perform a welfare check. The officer arrives, he meets Pat and Ken High. The officer notices newspapers on the front of the porch. The door was locked. And so the officer makes the decision that he's going to kick the door in. The officer immediately detects the strong odor of gas, and he observes an elderly male on the floor. Face down, there's a pool of blood around his head. There's an outdoor gas cooker hooked to the dryer gas jet just inside the kitchen. You would not want to use that type of cooker inside the house. The officer immediately turns the gas jet off, and the gas starts dissipating in the residence. And he looks at the body. To him, it's obvious that this person had been dead for several hours. Since it's the High's residence and it's an elderly male on the floor, the initial assumption is that it would be John High. Next, the officer proceeds to the master bedroom. He finds who he believes is Ruth High. There was a book beside her, and one of the pages was folded over as if she fell asleep while reading her book.
My partner and I are sent to the scene. I did the inside work, trying to determine if there's anything indicating foul play. We had to wait on the medical examiner because we're not really allowed to touch the body for further wounds. My partner, who was doing the witness portion, he informed Ken and his wife that his parents were deceased, possibly of gas inhalation.
My dad and my grandparents were very close. He was devastated.
I just couldn't believe that both my grandparents were gone at the exact same time. That just doesn't happen to many people.
So what you have at the scene is the smell of gas. You see a gas cooker hooked up in the kitchen. You see an elderly man, John High, lying on the kitchen floor. You see Ruth lying what appears to be peacefully asleep in her bed. No forced entry and nothing stolen from the house.
It was the officer's belief that John had fallen while messing with the gas cooker, struck his head, knocked himself unconscious, and either died from that wound or gas asphyxiation, and that Ruth High had fallen asleep and that she was overcome by the gas fumes as they moved through the house. It's an accidental death. They wrap it up, and that was it.
This is Grandma and Grandpa on their 50th wedding anniversary.
Oh, wow. They got dressed up a lot.
They got dressed up a lot.
No kidding. Look at that.
My grandmother was a native Houstonian. She was a homemaker.
She loved bridge. She loved her friends, loved to get dressed up for different events.
My grandfather worked for a Gulf Oil Corporation for 49 years. He was a geologist. He enjoyed being outdoors, golfing, fishing.
Oh, how cute.
This with both of us.
Don't y'all?
That's both of us, yes.
And Susie, the dog. We had Christmas Eve with our grandparents every year, and now we continue that as well. And that's what keeps them alive for us.
On the 9th of October, I was instructed to travel to the medical examiner's office and meet with Dr. Perungao, who had performed the autopsies. The medical examiner immediately informed us that John died from 6 blunt trauma blows to his head. And it created 6 lacerations, 2 to 3 inches in length. This is not a natural or an accidental death. John High had been murdered. After it was determined that John was murdered, we need further investigation because there was no forced entry into the house and there was nothing to indicate that Ruth was murdered. There was a possibility that Ruth High had killed her husband. It could have been a murder-suicide and that she died because the gas building up in the house. We need to return to the scene to see if we can find any information, any evidence that would be helpful.
I think the key to investigating any murder-suicide is to be methodical, thorough, and make sure you don't overlook any single detail. Finding any forensic evidence becomes top priority.
After the medical examiner's report, going back to a scene, we noticed some things. When someone is struck in the head, you have cast-off blood, and some of that was detected on some spots of the wall. And we found an axe handle behind a curtain in Ruth's bedroom. We think there's a possibility it might be the murder weapon, but we're not sure, so we collected as evidence.
There's a gas jet cooker on the floor. The gas cooker is designed to cook crawdads or shrimp. I went to the refrigerator and checking in the freezer, and I did not find any shrimp. There was a candle that had been lit, but it was out. If it was designed to set the gas off, somebody didn't know that. Natural gas doesn't behave that way. It tends to rise, so a candle would not have affected it.
This makes us think that somebody has planned this. Someone left the gas on in hopes that the house would blow up. And in the process of blowing up, destroy any evidence on the body. And then it's going to burn any other evidence up inside the house.
Murder-suicide was just unbelievable. My grandparents had a wonderful relationship.
Seeing them at their 50th wedding anniversary, knowing them from my childhood, that just was not possible. They loved each other way too much for anything like that to happen.
We suspected double homicide or a capital murder. It was something that we'd have to look into. Something that was unusual was John and Ruth's will were lying on the table in the living room.
John and Ruth High made the beneficiaries of their estate Ken High and his brother Gary High. Their estate was around $300,000 to $500,000. So everybody in the family needs to be questioned. You just can't arrest somebody. We need something.
It was a cold case.
The male, who refuses to identify himself, begins talking about a double murder that happened in '87.
One day has passed since the deaths of Ruth and John High. The murder investigation that started out as an accident and then turned into a murder-suicide based on what they saw and thought happened. The investigators realized how important it was for them to interview Ruth and John's sons, but the medical examiner called first.
Dr. Perungau called the homicide office. When he looked closer at Ruth, he noticed she had bruising on the inside of her lower lip, consistent with her lower teeth. Then he sees petechiae, small blood vessels that break when you're suffocated or strangled. She was probably smothered with a pillow or some sort of object forcefully against her face, causing the lips to be bruised by the teeth. Ruth High was murdered just like her husband.
With that knowledge, then the investigators needed to go back to the scene because there is no forced entry and the doors are locked and nothing appears to be stolen, and consider the idea that this is going to be somebody committing this murder who's in the world of John and Ruth High. Usually when you're talking about a murder, it's going to come down to one of three different main motives. It's going to be either greed or jealousy or revenge. but it sure feels like money is going to be the main factor here because they're worth some money. The number one priority would be to start talking to family members and very close friends about all the dynamics going on with that family.
Ken High is very successful. He's married, has 2 kids. He's close to his mother and father, but doesn't get to see them real often. He explains that he's not very close with his brother, Gary High. He blames that on their age difference. Ken is 8 years older than Gary.
Uncle Gary, my dad's brother, is the type of person that did not talk much, very reserved, very quiet, not very emotional. You just couldn't break that shell to get to know him.
We learned from Ken High about a guy named Duncan, Chuck Duncan. Chuck was the last person to speak to John and Ruth High. Chuck Duncan is business partner of Gary High, but he's also a lover to Gary.
Chuck was over at my grandparents' house all the time, doing stuff for him, helping him go to the doctors and things like that. He was always being invited to family events. He was pretty much included with anything that Gary would have been invited to.
As the investigation proceeds, we learn that Gary High is in a business called High Tech with 2 other people, Chuck and Robbie Duncan.
Ken felt that the company was not doing real well. They were having financial problems.
Ken opens up and he thinks Gary has been asking his dad for money. We need more information.
On October 9th, Gary, Chuck, and Robbie come into the homicide office and are interviewed.
The 3 men had a very unusual relationship. They were business partners, they were roommates, they were friends, and they were lovers.
We learned Robbie actually has changed his name from his birth name to match the name of Chuck Duncan. The 3 individuals function as a family unit, all live together, with Chuck being the head of the family. It's obvious during the interviews that he has firm control over Robbie and Gary High. Chuck wanted to lead the conversations. Like if you said, what did you do yesterday? And if they go to answer, he said, oh, remember you went to... It's like it's a little bit of a cult leader. You know, he's got such control over them. Chuck explains that he sees John and Ruth High often. He ran errands for them, even took John High to the doctor. The subject of the cooker comes up, and Chuck says that John High wanted to fry some shrimp. So Chuck went out and purchased a cooker and delivered it to the Highs. At the scene, we noticed some wills laying out in the open on a table inside the residence. Chuck alleges that John High and Ruth High wished to change their will and leave their inheritance to Gary. When the subject came up, Gary was surprised. You could tell by the expression on his face that he had never heard that before. I think in Chuck's mind, if he could have John and Ruth change their will, cut their oldest son out, then he would control whatever their inheritance was worth, $500,000.
We started questioning Gary, Chuck, and Robbie about their business to see whether they were having financial problems.
They said the company was doing well. So when we asked them how much money was in the bank, they guessed about $40,000. Bank records indicate something else. It was less than $10,000.
So then we tried to determine where they were when the murders happened. Gary and Robbie were in Seattle, Washington, where they were trying to set up a new business. Chuck was in Houston. He adamantly denied that he had anything to do with a double homicide, and even suggested that a gardener or a yard worker or something like that may be responsible for this.
Chuck Duncan is very smart and manipulative and controlling. And he's quick on his feet to come up with explanations and answers to convince HPD of what happened.
As investigators, Chuck raises the flag for us for a couple of reasons. One, he's the last person that saw John and Ruth High. Two, he is in dire straits financially. But you got to have evidence. You just can't arrest somebody.
When I first went to Special Crimes and they started to bring me all their cold cases, there were a couple that came through where I would read them and I would know who did it, but I didn't think there was enough to charge it. So I would keep the file and I put them in this drawer in my office, and I named the drawer my Waiting on God drawer. Those were the cases where I thought one day something's going to come along from God, from heaven, to make this case get solved. For example, a divorce, somebody getting out of prison, somebody all of a sudden coming forward with new information after so many years can make the case change. You're waiting on God to make it happen. 6 years after the murder of Ruth and John High, the Waiting on God drawer came into play, and God finally made something happen.
In August of 1993, night shift officer working in the desk in the homicide office receives a phone call from a male who refuses to identify himself and begins talking about having knowledge about a double murder that happened in '87. He even names John and Ruth High. He talks about his knowledge of it. Wants to know what kind of trouble he could be in. The officer, he tape records it. When I'm listening to the tape recording, I recognize his voice. It's Robbie.
Robbie Duncan was the third member of the triangle relationship between him and Chuck and Gary. At some point after the investigation kind of quieted down, Robbie Duncan left the relationship. He talked a lot about how much control Chuck Duncan had over both him and Gary, and how good it felt to get out of that controlling relationship.
After Robbie called the night shift desk, Johnny Moore came to me. He had this cold case that was 6 years old, the murder of John and Ruth High. So myself and Johnny Moore drove out to Kingwood, where Robbie was living. He greeted us, invited us in, was very cordial. And almost like a weight was off of his shoulders because he was cooperating with law enforcement and doing the right thing.
He's willing to talk, but he has concerns. He wanted immunity. And we decided to offer him limited immunity. If he didn't commit the murder, he would not be prosecuted.
Robbie was granted limited immunity, meaning that anything he would testify to under oath couldn't be used against him. It made him feel safer, which helped further the prosecution of the case.
He said during their life together, Chuck would bring up the subject of if the Highs would just die.
According to Robbie, Chuck believed that the Highs were millionaires. So if Gary came into the inheritance from his parents, Chuck would definitely benefit through his relationship with Gary. Robbie admits that Chuck was talking about committing the murders to benefit them financially, but he claims he didn't know when it was going to happen.
One day, on October of 1987, Robbie and Gary decide to go to Seattle to see if it was good to move their company there. Chuck Duncan calls up to Seattle. Chuck tells Robbie, I did it, it's over. John fought like hell, and Ruth went peacefully.
Then Robbie said, talk to Gary, handed the phone to Gary. Gary has a blank, sharp stare, not speaking much. There wasn't a sense of excitement that they're finally dead or that there was trepidation that they were going to get caught. It was more of a realization that the murders had been carried out.
During my 16 years in homicide, I've come across a lot of killers. Chuck Duncan is evil to the core. You know, they were friends with him. He doted over them, but he doted over them with a sick purpose to worm his way into their money. I mean, he had to plan this. This is his cold-blooded murder.
Knowing about a crime after it's been committed, knowing who did it and knowing what happened, but yet not reporting it to the police does not make Robbie guilty of a crime in Texas. And so choosing not to come forward to tell on Chuck doesn't make them guilty of anything. Makes a jury not like them, doesn't make them guilty.
There was no physical evidence, no fingerprints or video recordings or anything of the crime. And so we formulated a plan on how to get incriminating information and build a stronger case against Chuck.
Let's see if we can get Robbie to make a phone call to Gary High and Chuck Duncan, and hopefully get Chuck Duncan to make some sort of admission.
If you have someone, a civilian like Robbie, acting on behalf of the police, that might not be allowed if you're calling somebody who's locked up in prison behind bars. You got to remember, Duncan is in the free world. The same rules don't apply. That's why this is not entrapment.
There's always a danger to tipping off the suspect in the case when you have someone who is not an actor play this role. Chuck answered the phone. They started talking, and I'm standing there writing notes to Robbie on what to say.
Is Gary still living with you?
He had a lot of trouble after the situation. Gary went into a deep, deep tailspin.
And then Robbie said, there's a private investigator who's looking into this matter. He's going to ask questions. What should I say?
I don't know if he's going to ask, you know.
Don't. You don't have to answer anything.
Robbie's trying to be really good about how he handles him. But when he says, I wished you wouldn't have done that, Chuck says, I didn't do nothing. I'm not guilty of anything. But somewhere a long ways down in there, he indicates that he did it for the family unit.
We've gone through it. It's over with. It's behind us. And even if, for instance, there was something that I had done and I confessed to it, do you think you and Gary wouldn't be unscathed by it? I mean, y'all be dragged right down with me.
The most incriminating thing that Chuck said was, law enforcement has no evidence. Just stick with the story. You got to be strong, because if I go down and confess, then everybody goes down.
Well, yeah, you know, that's why.
I won't allow that to happen. I won't.
He was threatening that they could all be implicated. And that was essentially making a tacit admission that he was involved in the murder of John and Ruth High.
I remember listening to those tapes, listening for that juicy slip-up that Chuck Duncan made. There's not one. There's more little subtle innuendos, things that you wouldn't say if you were completely innocent. But the context of these tape-recorded conversations, along with the financial incentive with Ruth and John's inheritance, the fact that the company was really crumbling and not doing financially well at all, you have your motive. The fact that Chuck Duncan was the last person to see them alive, and that along with all the other circumstances about how the house was left that day, that's enough to move the case forward.
We then secured an arrest warrant for Chuck Duncan for capital murder.
After getting our recordings of the telephone conversations between Chuck, Gary, and Robbie, we obtained an arrest warrant for Chuck Duncan. Sergeant Belk and I flew to Seattle, where Gary and Chuck are now living.
We met with a fugitive task force. I approached the front door with a couple of police officers, and they banged on the door. There was a long delay. They kept banging on the door, and then eventually looked up on the second floor, and a white male looked out the blinds at us.
Eventually, Chuck came to the door, and he was told he was under arrest for murder.
There was not much reaction from Chuck Duncan when we took him into custody.
Gary Hise and Chuck Duncan. Our information was that they were living together, so it was not a surprise that he was there.
My goal was to try and talk to Gary while the tension was high and see if I could get him to cooperate. Gary asked, "Am I under arrest?" And I said, "No, you're not under arrest." And he said, "Well, if I'm not under arrest and you don't have a search warrant, then y'all need to leave the townhome." I mean, Gary's parents were murdered, and he refused to cooperate, refused to talk to us, ordered us out of the house.
We have nothing whatsoever to indicate that he helped plan it. And we know he didn't participate in it. So he gets to walk.
When your dad realized that his own brother could be involved, can you talk about how that affected your dad?
Never have seen him so sad in all my life.
Yeah.
Wow.
And I think he just felt so deceived. And so, you know, how could this happen?
I think I'd be mad too, mad and sad, and just want to scream at your brother.
It was more about Chuck.
Really?
Yeah.
Really? What do you think he ended up thinking about it?
Chuck just had control over Gary.
Even before all this, you could tell?
Oh, absolutely.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Chuck was taken to a local law enforcement agency and read him his legal warnings. He acknowledged that he understood the warnings and waived them and was willing to talk, which was no surprise because he was a talker. I mean, and he thought he could talk his way out of everything.
He thinks he's smarter than you are. So he's trying to figure out what I might have or might not have on him. And so he's really curious.
I told him that Robbie fully cooperated with us and also told him about the phone calls were recorded.
You can see his wheels are turning. Now he's trying to think through the conversation.
Setting up this recorded conversation with Chuck Duncan is kind of like what we do on Cold Justice every case we work. You try to get them to give you a statement, a version of what happened, and then they're locked into it because they've said it. Then if they change that version, that can be pretty damning.
He knew he was in a lot of trouble. And so, in typical fashion, Chuck concocted another story.
I didn't do it, but I helped do it. Ruth told me she wanted a mercy killing. She wanted somebody to kill her and her husband because they were old, getting frail, and she didn't want to suffer.
And Ruth was paranoid about that. She says, "I need to be able to rely on you, Chuck." She says, I would do anything in the world for you and Gary and Robbie. But I got to have peace of mind, and if I can find a solution. She says, "I don't want to wait until I'm in a wheelchair being given tranquilizers at a nursing home." She says, "I can't face that." And she said, "I would rather pick and choose the time of my death." And that's exactly what she said.
According to Chuck, Ruth asked him to find someone to kill her and she would pay for it, kind of like an assisted suicide or whatever. He called it a mercy killing. He says, "I wasn't there, so I really don't know what happened. I hired 2 yard guys to go do it. And one guy's name was Oscar, and then he mowed the facility where their business was."
I told the boys, not Rob and Gary, but these Hispanics, that they were old and they wanted to go out peacefully. And this is a sum of money, and the money would be there waiting in the house, and for them to pick it up. And that was how the arrangement was.
We had no other choice but to pursue names of all the yard men. We interviewed them, and we knew it was a bogus story, but you still had to close that door.
In his mind, the fact that he presents it as a mercy killing, he would only do a little bit of time in the prison if he was found guilty.
Chuck is putting himself directly responsible for the deaths of John and Ruth High, but not admitting that he physically killed them. It didn't matter to us. We didn't need the truth. We just needed an admission, and he made an admission.
Chuck Duncan is charged with capital murder in the deaths of John and Ruth High.
This case was actually filed two different ways. One is it's a double murder, 2 people were killed, and also it's a murder for remuneration. When a murder is committed over money because of money, you can also file capital murder charges that way. I think that when you listen to every line of every word that came out of Chuck Duncan's mouth, Chuck Duncan did not help himself by talking that day to Billy Bell.
Billy, Sergeant Bell, is a very good interrogator,
Yeah.
very good interviewer. He's a hostage negotiator. Since I had dealt with Duncan before, I thought Billy would be a good fit.
And it worked.
And it worked.
As we get ready to go to trial, I remember, because I looked at the date, I was 5 months pregnant then.
You were?
With my daughter, who just became a prosecutor a month ago. Isn't that
Wow.
funny? It's been a lifetime, Johnny.
Yes, it has.
But this was my first cold case where it had this twist to it. And I think the big thing for me was how much the whole case came down to Robbie. I knew that I had to figure out a way to let Robbie get up on the stand and testify against Chuck Duncan. But the main challenge of trying this case with Robbie is that I didn't know what a jury was going to think about him. I didn't know what a jury of 12 people would think about a grown man being involved in this odd relationship and knowing full well that 2 wonderful people have been murdered and never telling anybody in law enforcement the whole truth for 6 years. How are we going to make sure that the jury understands he's credible? Because if a jury hated him, we were going to lose. One thing I had to deal with the case once y'all passed it on to the DA's office, from the very beginning I was always very stressed about Robbie. When he came forward, thank God he did, but it took 6 years. Was the jury going to hate him? You know, getting the jury ready to understand where he was coming from, and he did the right thing. Even if you think you would have handled it differently, let's see if he's credible.
Right.
He was the foundation and crux of the whole case.
Sure.
I was taught a long time ago as a baby prosecutor, every case has a theme. You take the weakness of your case and you make it your theme. So in this case, the issue with the case was, what are we going to do about Robbie? You have to take that and make it your theme and deal with it head on. He comes kind of tainted. He comes kind of muddy because of the way he came around to finally tell him what he knows. One opening statement, I brought up that Chuck Duncan committed the murder, but in August of 1993, Robbie could no longer live with what he knew, and he called and came forward. And maybe he took too long to get here, and maybe he didn't do it like you, but we are only in this courtroom because that man came forward. And the bottom line here was to make the jury believe him, even if they still didn't like him. My plan was to have Robbie testify last, so that by the time he hit the witness stand, HPD, the investigators, would have already explained the rest of the physical evidence and all the other incriminating factors against Chuck Duncan. On the off chance that maybe a couple of jurors might not like Robbie, they still understood the lay of the land and his part to play in all of this.
Kelly Siegler is a rock star. She was excellent in the courtroom before a jury. Very persuasive, methodical in building her case. But the biggest impact that my testimony had was Kelly Siegler playing the confession I had with Chuck Duncan, and in his own words, him explaining that he's ultimately responsible for the deaths because he did a mercy killing.
I told the jury, if this was really a mercy killing, why would you need to hit John High 6 times in the head? So the whole story was just stupid in the first place, and it even ended up being kind of laughable. Like, if the jury's going to buy that, come on, no one's going to believe this story, just to show yet again what a manipulative liar he is. He was too big for his own britches, as my mother used to say. So as much as I could present evidence-wise, it was time to call Robbie Duncan to the stand. Before the trial, he came down to my office and we sat there for hours going over the questions for direct. We practiced it. He knew what he needed to do and say. I tried to play defense lawyer and throw cross-examination questions at him and things that I thought that Connie Williams would pick on him about. Connie Williams was Richard Charles Duncan's lead defense lawyer. He was very well respected. He was very well known, and Duncan was very lucky to get him to be his lawyer. That was the single longest written out prep for a witness of any case I ever had. Because usually you have, like 10 civilian witnesses with a little piece.
Right.
But Robbie was the motive. Without Robbie's information, though, think about it, getting the jury ready to understand that Chuck killed the Highs for their money would be pretty much impossible. Robbie was the relationship and dynamic. Robbie's the one that shed light on Chuck's control over them even after confessing to the murder. He was the last witness. He was almost a whole day. He told the truth, told it like it was, and then Connie Williams cross-examined him. And I remember thinking, past the witness, okay, here we go. How's this going to go? And Connie started cross-examining Robbie, thinking as he went on, he's doing okay. You just have to sit there, right? Being cool. He's doing okay. And I thought, ooh, he did all right.
He always came across like he was telling me the truth.
Yeah. Some of it was my prep, but Robbie was pretty good. Every kind of way they could insult him, Connie did a good job of trying to do. Why did it take you this long? Isn't it true that you're mad at them and you're paying them back? Isn't it true you helped? Isn't it true you're involved? He might have gotten a little defensive, but even when he got defensive, his answers made sense. He owned that he should have come clean sooner. He owned that he should have been less of a mouse around Chuck Duncan, that he should have been more of a man and done the right thing. He owned all that. You just have to hope that at the end of the day, that came across as credible to the jury. On May the 25th, 1995, after 6 days in trial, I rested my case against Chuck Duncan. The evidence was mostly circumstantial, but it was a strong case. And I remember telling the jury in final argument, you know now what kind of a man he is. And so you go back there and you ask yourself, is this man who sits before you today guilty of capital murder? Because if you don't believe he is, are you going to let him go home with you?
I don't remember Chuck looking very concerned. I think he thought, I'm going to keep getting away with things. It was very hard to see him there, knowing that he was the one that took my grandparents' life.
The jury went out. I think it only took them about 20 minutes, and they came back with a guilty verdict, guilty of capital murder.
After that, Chuck was sentenced to death.
After all this time, John and Ruth got justice.
When the jury came back with the death penalty, I felt happy. I felt vindicated. I was glad for my dad, and I was thinking that my grandparents were in heaven shouting hallelujah.
Whatever you think of him, if it weren't for Robbie, Charles Duncan wouldn't have been executed. Because of him.
Right.
Because of him.
The whole case.
The whole case.
Right.
And that's not an easy thing to have to let your whole case rest on one person. But that's what happened.
Charles Duncan was executed by lethal injection in 2003.
Chuck's last words was, I'm innocent.
Wow. You think at the last minute, the defendant, the killer, will say they're sorry and admit it, and they never do. I've asked a lot of families after they go through an execution. The first time he got scheduled, I was supposed to come with y'all, and it got reset, because they always do. And then it finally happened in 2003, 8 years later.
There's no comparison of what happened to Chuck and what happened to my grandparents.
Right.
Even though there's not full closure, it is closing a chapter and feeling like there's been justice that's been done, for sure.
I still run into way too many families that never get justice. They're still waiting to get justice. So what would you tell somebody?
Don't give up, have hope, and be there for each other so that you can get through it.
After the trial, Ken High never tried to fight Gary High in court over the will, over the estate. They let him have his share, but they never spoke again. And when he passed away, they didn't go to his funeral. My very first cold case that was a death penalty case was far from easy. This case revolved around the issue of having a not sympathetic witness. And so addressing that head on were the keys to the prosecution of this case. Not what a lot of people think are the problems with a death penalty case, especially today in the age of DNA and forensic evidence, but it boiled down to something that simple. Justice for the High family did not come quickly. It took a lot of years. The waiting on God drawer came into play, and they finally did get justice.